Metaphysical Thirst. Arthur Schopenhauer on Religion and Philosophy. Written by Arthur Schopenhauer. Narrated by Bruun. Religion. A Dialogue. Demophiles. Between ourselves, my dear fellow, I don't care about the way you sometimes have of exhibiting your talent for philosophy. You make religion a subject of sarcastic remarks, and even for open ridicule. Everyone thinks his religion sacred, and therefore you ought to respect it. Philadelphus. That doesn't follow. I don't see why, because other people are simpletons, I should have any regard for a pack of lies. I respect truth everywhere, and so I can't respect what is opposed to it. My maxim is vigeat veritas et pereat mundus, like the lawyers' fiat justitia et pereat mundus. Every profession ought to have an analogous advice. Demophiles. Then I suppose doctors should say fiant pillulae et pereat mundus. There wouldn't be much difficulty about that. Philadelphus. Heaven forbid. You must take everything cum grano salis. Demophiles. Exactly. And that's why I want you to take religion cum grano salis. I want you to see that one must meet the requirements of the people according to the measure of their comprehension. Where you have masses of people of crude susceptibilities and clumsy intelligence, sordid in their pursuits and sunk in drudgery, religion provides the only means of proclaiming and making them feel the height import of life. For the average man takes an interest primarily in nothing but what will satisfy his physical needs and hankerings, and beyond this, give him a little amusement and pastime. Founders of religion and philosophers come into the world to rouse him from this stupor, and point to the lofty meaning of existence. Philosophers for the few, the emancipated, founders of religion for the many, for humanity at large. For, as your friend Plato has said, the multitude can't be philosophers, and you shouldn't forget that. Religion is the metaphysics of the masses. By all means let them keep it. Let it therefore command external respect. For to discredit it is to take it away. Just as they have popular poetry and the popular wisdom of proverbs, so they must have popular metaphysics too. For mankind absolutely needs an interpretation of life, and this, again, must be suited to popular comprehension. Consequently, this interpretation is always an allegorical investiture of the truth, and in practical life and in its effects on the feelings, that is to say, as a rule of action, and as a comfort and consolation in suffering and death. It accomplishes perhaps just as much as the truth itself could achieve if we possessed it. Don't take offense at its unkempt, grotesque, and apparently absurd form. For with your education and learning, you have no idea of the roundabout ways by which people in their crude state have to receive their knowledge of deep truths. The various religions are only various forms in which the truth, which taken by itself is above their comprehension, is grasped and realized by the masses. And truth becomes inseparable from these forms. Therefore, my dear sir, don't take it amiss if I say that to make a mockery of these forms is both shallow and unjust. Philadelphus. But isn't it every bit as shallow and unjust to demand that there shall be no other system of metaphysics but this one, cut out as it is to suit the requirements and comprehension of the masses? That its doctrine shall be the limit of human speculation, the standard of all thought, so that the metaphysics of the few, the emancipated as you call them, must be devoted only to confirming, strengthening, and explaining the metaphysics of the masses? That the highest powers of human intelligence shall remain unused and undeveloped, even be nipped in the bud, in order that their activity may not thwart the popular metaphysics? And isn't this just the very claim which religion sets up? Isn't it a little too much to have tolerance and delicate forbearance preached by what is intolerance and cruelty itself? Think of the heretical tribunals, inquisitions, religious wars, crusades, Socrates' cup of poison, Bruno and Vanini's death in the flames. Is all this today quite a thing of the past? How can genuine philosophical effort, sincere search after truth, the noblest calling of noblest men, be let and hindered more completely than by a conventional system of metaphysics enjoying a state monopoly, the principles of which are impressed into every head in earliest youth so earnestly, so deeply, and so firmly that, unless the mind is miraculously elastic, they remain indelible. In this way the groundwork of all healthy reason is once for all deranged. That is to say, the capacity for original thought and unbiased judgment, which is weak enough in itself, in regard to those subjects to which it might be applied, forever paralyzed and ruined. Demophiles. Which means, I suppose, that people have arrived at a conviction which they won't give up in order to embrace yours instead. Philonethes. Ah, if it were only conviction based on insight! Then one could bring arguments to bear, and the battle would be fought with equal weapons. But religions admittedly appeal not to conviction as the result of argument, but to belief as demanded by revelation. And as the capacity for believing is strongest in childhood, special care is taken to make sure of this tender age. This has much more to do with the doctrines of belief taking root than threats and reports of miracles. If, in early childhood, certain fundamental views and doctrines are paraded with unusual solemnity, and an air of the greatest earnestness never before visible in anything else, if at the same time the possibility of a doubt about them be completely passed over, or touched upon only to indicate that doubt is the first step to eternal perdition, the resulting impression will be so deep that, as a rule, that is, in almost every case, doubt about them will be almost as impossible as doubt about one's own existence. Hardly 1 in 10,000 will have the strength of mind to ask himself seriously and earnestly, is that true? To call such as can do it strong minds, esprit fort, is a description more apt than is generally supposed. But for the ordinary mind there is nothing so absurd or revolting but what, if inculcated in that way, the strongest belief in it will strike root. If, for example, the killing of a heretic or infidel were essential to the future salvation of his soul, almost every one would make it the chief event of his life, and in dying would draw consolation and strength from the remembrance that he had succeeded. As a matter of fact, almost every Spaniard in days gone by used to look upon an auto da fe as the most pious of all acts and one most agreeable to God. A parallel to this may be found in the way in which the Thugs, a religious sect in India suppressed a short time ago by the English, who executed numbers of them, express their sense of religion and their veneration for the goddess Kali. They take every opportunity of murdering their friends and traveling companions, with the object of getting possession of their goods, and in the serious conviction that they are doing a praiseworthy action conducive to their eternal welfare. The power of religious dogma, when inculcated early, is such as to stifle conscience, compassion, and finally every feeling of humanity. But if you want to see with your own eyes, and close at hand what timely inoculation will accomplish, look at the English. Here is a nation favored before all others by nature, endowed more than all others with discernment, intelligence, power of judgment, strength of character. Look at them, abased and made ridiculous beyond all others by their stupid ecclesiastical superstition, which appears amongst their other abilities like a fixed idea or monomania. For this they have to thank the circumstance that education is in the hands of the clergy, whose endeavor it is to impress all the articles of belief at the earliest age in a way that amounts to a kind of paralysis of the brain. This, in turn, expresses itself all their life in an idiotic bigotry, which makes otherwise most sensible and intelligent people amongst them degrade themselves, so that one can't make head or tail of them. If you consider how essential to such a masterpiece is inoculation in the tender age of childhood, the missionary system appears no longer only as the acme of human importunity, arrogance, and impertinence, but also as an absurdity. If it doesn't confine itself to nations which are still in their infancy, like Kaffirs, Hottentots, South Sea Islanders, etc., amongst these races it is successful. But in India, the Brahmins treat the discourses of the missionaries with contemptuous smiles of approbation, or simply shrug their shoulders. And one may say generally that the proselytizing efforts of the missionaries in India, in spite of the most advantageous facilities, are, as a rule, a failure. An authentic report in the volume 21 of the Asiatic Journal, 1826, states that after so many years of missionary activity, not more than 300 living converts were to be found in the whole of India, where the population of the English possessions alone comes to 115 millions. And at the same time it is admitted that the Christian converts are distinguished for their extreme immorality. 300 venal and bribed souls out of so many millions. There is no evidence that things have gone better with Christianity in India since then, in spite of the fact that the missionaries are now trying, contrary to stipulation and in schools exclusively designed for secular English instruction, to work upon the children's minds as they please, in order to smuggle in Christianity, against which the Hindus are most jealously on their guard. As I have said, childhood is the time to sow the seeds of belief, and not manhood, more especially where an earlier faith has taken root. An acquired conviction, such as is feigned by adults, is, as a rule, only the mask for some kind of personal interest, and it is the feeling that this is almost bound to be the case which makes a man who has changed his religion in mature years an object of contempt to most people everywhere, who thus show that they look upon religion not as a matter of reasoned conviction, but merely as a belief inoculated in childhood before any test can be applied. And that they are right in their view of religion is also obvious from the way in which not only the masses, who are blindly credulous, but also the clergy of every religion, who as such have faithfully and zealously studied its sources, foundations, dogmas, and disputed points, cleave as a body to the religion of their particular country. Consequently, for a minister of one religion or confession to go over to another is the rarest thing in the world. The Catholic clergy, for example, are fully convinced of the truth of all the tenets of their church, and so are the Protestant clergy of theirs, and both defend the principles of their creeds with like zeal. And yet, the conviction is governed merely by the country native to each. To the South German ecclesiastic, the truth of the Catholic dogma is quite obvious. To the North German, the Protestant. If, then, these convictions are based on objective reasons, the reasons must be climatic, and thrive like plants, some only here, some only there. The convictions of those who are thus locally convinced are taken on trust and believed by the masses everywhere. Demophiles. Well, no harm is done, and it doesn't make any real difference. As a fact, Protestantism is more suited to the North, Catholicism to the South. Philalethes. So it seems. Still, I take a higher standpoint, and keep in view a more important object, the progress, namely, of the knowledge of truth among mankind. And from this point of view, it is a terrible thing that wherever man is born, certain propositions are inculcated in him in earliest youth, and he is assured that he may never have any doubts about them, under penalty of thereby forfeiting eternal salvation. Propositions, I mean, which affect the foundation of all our other knowledge and accordingly determine forever, and if they are false, distort forever, the point of view from which our knowledge starts. And as further, the corollaries of these propositions touch the entire system of our intellectual attainments at every point, the whole of human knowledge is thoroughly adulterated by them. Evidence of this is afforded by every literature, the most striking by that of the Middle Age, but in a too considerable degree by that of the 15th and 16th centuries. Look at even the first minds of all these epochs, how paralyzed they are by false fundamental positions like these, how more especially all insight into the true constitution and working of nature is, as it were, blocked up. During the whole of the Christian period, theism lies like a mountain on all intellectual and chiefly on all philosophical efforts, and arrests or stunts all progress. For the scientific men of these ages, God, devils, angels, demons hid the whole of nature. No inquiry was followed to the end. Nothing ever thoroughly examined. Everything which went beyond the most obvious casual nexus was immediately set down to these personalities. It was at once explained by a reference to God, angels, or demons, as Pomponius expressed himself when the matter was being discussed, and philosophers at any rate have nothing analogous. There is, to be sure, a suspicion of irony in this statement of Pomponius, as his perfidy in other matters is known. Still, he is only giving expression to the general way of thinking of his age. And if, on the other hand, anyone possessed the rare quality of an elastic mind, which alone could burst the bonds, his writings, and he himself with them, were burnt, as happened to Bruno and Vanini. How completely an ordinary mind is paralyzed by that early preparation in metaphysics is seen in the most vivid way and on its most ridiculous side, where such a one undertakes to criticize the doctrines of an alien creed. The efforts of the ordinary man are generally found to be directed to a careful exhibition of the incongruity of its dogmas with those of his own belief. He is at great pains to show that not only do they not say, but certainly do not mean the same thing. And with that he thinks, in his simplicity, that he has demonstrated the falsehood of the alien creed. He never really dreams of putting the question which of the two may be right. His own articles of belief he looks upon as a priori true and certain principles. Demophiles. So that's your higher point of view? I assure you there is a higher still. First live, then philosophize, is a maxim of more comprehensive import than appears at first sight. The first thing to do is to control the raw and evil dispositions of the masses, so as to keep them from pushing injustice to extremes, and from committing cruel, violent, and disgraceful acts. If you were to wait until they had recognized and grasped the truth, you would undoubtedly come too late, and truth, supposing that it had been found, would surpass their powers of comprehension. In any case, an allegorical investiture of it, a parable or myth, is all that would be of any service to them. As Kant said, there must be a public standard of right and virtue. It must always flutter high overhead. It is a matter of indifference what heraldic figures are inscribed on it, so long as they signify what is meant. Such an allegorical representation of truth is always and everywhere, for humanity at large, a serviceable substitute for a truth to which it can never attain, for a philosophy which it can never grasp, let alone the fact that it is daily changing its shape. and has in no form as yet met with general acceptance. Practical aims, then, my good Philalethes, are in every respect superior to theoretical. Philalethes. What you say is very like the ancient advice of Timaeus of Locrus, the Pythagorean. Stop the mind with falsehood if you can't speed it with truth. I almost suspect that your plan is the one which is so much in vogue just now, that you want to impress upon me that the hour is nigh when we may feast in quiet. You recommend us, in fact, to take timely precautions so that the waves of the discontented raging masses mayn't disturb us at table. But the whole point of view is as false as it is nowadays popular and commended. And so, I make haste to enter a protest against it. It is false that state, justice, law cannot be upheld without the assistance of religion and its dogmas, and that justice and public order need religion as a necessary complement if legislative enactments are to be carried out. It is false were it repeated 100 times. An effective and striking argument to the contrary is afforded by the ancients, especially the Greeks. They had nothing at all of what we understand by religion. They had no sacred documents, no dogma to be learned and its acceptance furthered by everyone, its principles to be inculcated early on the young. Just as little was moral document preached by the ministers of religion, nor did the priests trouble themselves about morality or about what the people did or left undone, not at all. The duty of the priests was confined to temple ceremonial, prayers, hymns, sacrifices, processions, lustrations, and the like, the object of which was anything but the moral improvement of the individual. What was called religion consisted, more especially in the cities, in giving temples here and there to some of the gods of the greater tribes, in which the worship described was carried on as a state matter, and was consequently, in fact, an affair of police. No one, except the functionaries performing, was in any way compelled to attend, or even to believe in it. In the whole of antiquity there is no trace of any obligation to believe in any particular dogma. Merely in the case of an open denial of the existence of the gods, or any other reviling of them, a penalty was imposed, and that on account of the insult offered to the state, which served these gods. Beyond this, it was free to everyone to think of them what he pleased. If anyone wanted to gain the favor of those gods privately, by prayer or sacrifice, it was open to him to do so at his own expense and at his own risk. If he didn't do it, no one made any objection, least of all the state. In the case of the Romans, everyone has his own lares and penates at home. They were, however, in reality, only the venerated busts of ancestors. Of the immortality of the soul and a life beyond the grave, the ancients had no firm, clear, or least of all dogmatically fixed idea, but very loose, fluctuating, indefinite, and problematical notions, every one in his own way. And the ideas about the gods were just as varying, individual, and vague. There was, therefore, really no religion, in our sense of the word, amongst the ancients. But did anarchy and lawlessness prevail amongst them on that account? Is not law and civil order rather so much their work that it still forms the foundation of our own? Was there not complete protection for property, even though it consisted for the most part of slaves? And did not this state of things last for more than 1,000 years? So that I can't recognize, I must even protest against, the practical aims and the necessity of religion in the sense indicated by you, and so popular nowadays, that is, an indispensable foundation of all legislative arrangements. For if you take that point of view, the pure and sacred endeavor after truth would, to say the least, appear quixotic, even criminal, if it ventured, in its feeling of justice, to denounce the authoritative creed as a usurper who had taken possession of the throne of truth and maintained his position by keeping up the deception. Demophiles. But religion is not opposed to truth. It itself teaches truth. And as the range of its activity is not a narrow lecture room, but the world and humanity at large, religion must conform to the requirements and comprehension of an audience so numerous and so mixed. Religion must not let truth appear in its naked form, or, to use a medical simile, it must not exhibit it pure, but must employ a mythical vehicle, a medium, as it were. You can also compare truth in this respect to certain chemical stuffs which in themselves are gaseous, but which for medicinal uses, and also for preservation or transmission, must be bound to a stable, solid base, because they would otherwise volatilize. Chlorine gas, for example, is for all purposes applied only in the form of chlorides. But if truth, pure, abstract, and free from all mythical alloy, is always to remain unattainable even by philosophers, it might be compared to fluorine, which cannot even be isolated, but must always appear in combination with other elements. Or, to take a less scientific simile, truth, which is inexpressible except by means of myth and allegory, is like water, which can be carried about only in vessels. A philosopher who insists on obtaining it pure is like a man who breaks the jug in order to get the water by itself. This is perhaps an exact analogy. At any rate, religion is truth allegorically and mythically expressed, and so rendered attainable and digestible by mankind in general. Mankind couldn't possibly take it pure and unmixed. Just as we can't breathe pure oxygen, we require an addition of 4 times its bulk in nitrogen. In plain language, the profound meaning, the high aim of life, can only be unfolded and presented to the masses symbolically, because they are incapable of grasping it in its true signification. Philosophy, on the other hand, should be like the Eleusinian mysteries, for the few, the elite. Philaletes. I understand. It comes, in short, to truth wearing the garment of falsehood. But in doing so, it enters on a fatal alliance. What a dangerous weapon is put into the hands of those who are authorized to employ falsehood as a vehicle of truth. If it is as you say, I fear the damage caused by the falsehood will be greater than any advantage the truth could ever produce. Of course, if the allegory were admitted to be such, I should raise no objection. But with the admission, it would rob itself of all respect, and consequently of all utility. The allegory must, therefore, put in a claim to be true, in the proper sense of the word, and maintain the claim, while at the most it is true only in an allegorical sense. Here lies the irreparable mischief, the permanent evil, and this is why religion has always been and always will be in conflict with the noble endeavor after pure truth. Demophiles. Oh no! That danger is guarded against. If religion mayn't exactly confess its allegorical nature, it gives sufficient indication of it. Philaletes. How so? Demophiles. In its mysteries. Mystery is in reality only a technical, theological term for religious allegory. All religions have their mysteries. Properly speaking, a mystery is a dogma which is plainly absurd, but which, nevertheless, conceals in itself a lofty truth, and one which by itself would be completely incomprehensible to the ordinary understanding of the raw multitude. The multitude accepts it in this disguise on trust, and believes it without being led astray by the absurdity of it. which even to its intelligence is obvious, and in this way it participates in the kernel of the matter so far as it is possible for it to do so. To explain what I mean, I may add that even in philosophy an attempt has been made to make use of a mystery. Pascal, for example, who was once a pietist, a mathematician, and a philosopher, says in this threefold capacity, God is everywhere and nowhere periphery. Malebranche has also the just remark, liberty is a mystery. One could go a step further and maintain that in religions everything is mystery. For to impart truth in the proper sense of the word to the multitude in its raw state is absolutely impossible. All that can fall to its lot is to be enlightened by a mythological reflection of it. Naked truth is out of place before the eyes of the profane vulgar. It can only make its appearance thickly veiled. Hence, it is unreasonable to require of a religion that it shall be true in the proper sense of the word. And this, I may observe in passing, is nowadays the absurd contention of rationalists and supernaturalists alike. Both start from the position that religion must be the real truth. And while the former demonstrate that it is not the truth, the latter obstinately maintain that it is. Or rather, the former dress up and arrange the allegorical element in such a way that, in the proper sense of the word, it could be true, but would be in that case a platitude, while the latter wish to maintain that it is true in the proper sense of the word, without any further dressing, a belief which, as we ought to know, is only to be enforced by inquisitions and the stake. As a fact, however, myth and allegory really form the proper element of religion, and under this indispensable condition, which is imposed by the intellectual limitation of the multitude, religion provides a sufficient satisfaction for those metaphysical requirements of mankind which are indestructible. It takes the place of that pure philosophical truth which is infinitely difficult and perhaps never attainable. Philalethes. Just as a wooden leg takes the place of a natural one. It supplies what is lacking, barely does duty for it, claims to be regarded as a natural leg, and is more or less artfully put together. The only difference is that whilst a natural leg as a rule preceded the wooden one, religion has everywhere got the start of philosophy. Demophiles. That may be, but still, for a man who hasn't a natural leg, a wooden one is of great service. You must bear in mind that the metaphysical needs of mankind absolutely require satisfaction, because the horizon of men's thoughts must have a background and not remain unbounded. Man has, as a rule, no faculty for weighing reasons and discriminating between what is false and what is true. And besides, the labor which nature and the needs of nature impose upon him leaves him no time for such inquiries, or for the education which they presuppose. In his case, therefore, it is no use talking of a reasoned conviction. He has to fall back on belief and authority. If a really true philosophy were to take the place of religion, 9/10 at least of mankind would have to receive it on authority. That is to say, it too would be a matter of faith. For Plato's dictum that the multitude can't be philosophers will always remain true. Authority, however, is an affair of time and circumstance alone, so it can't be bestowed on that which has only reason in its favor. It must accordingly be allowed to nothing but what has acquired it in the course of history, even if it is only an allegorical representation of the truth. Truth in this form, supported by authority, appeals first to all those elements in the human constitution which are strictly metaphysical, that is to say, to the need man feels of a theory in regard to the riddle of existence which forces itself upon his notice, a need arising from the consciousness that behind the physical in the world there is a metaphysical, something permanent as the foundation of constant change. Then it appeals to the will, to the fears and hopes of mortal beings living in constant struggle, for whom, accordingly, religion creates gods and demons whom they can cry to, appease, and win over. Finally, it appeals to that moral consciousness which is undeniably present in man, lends to it that corroboration and support without which it would not easily maintain itself in the struggle against so many temptations. It is just from this side that religion affords an inexhaustible source of consolation and comfort in the innumerable trials of life, a comfort which does not leave men in death, but rather then only unfolds its full efficacy. So religion may be compared to one who takes a blind man by the hand and leads him, because he is unable to see for himself, whose concern it is to reach his destination, not to look at everything by the way. Philadelphus. That is certainly the strong point of religion. If it is a fraud, it is a pious fraud, that is undeniable. But this makes priests something between deceivers and teachers of morality. They daren't teach the real truth, as you have quite rightly explained, even if they knew it, which is not the case. A true philosophy, then, can always exist, but not a true religion. True, I mean, in the proper understanding of the word, not merely in that flowery or allegorical sense which you have described, a sense in which all religions would be true only in various degrees. It is quite in keeping with the inextricable mixture of weal and woe, honesty and deceit, good and evil, nobility and baseless, which is the average characteristic of the world everywhere, that the most important, the most lofty, the most sacred truths can make their appearance only in combination with a lie, can even borrow strength from a lie from something that works more powerfully on mankind, and, as revelation, must be ushered in by a lie. This might indeed be regarded as the cachet of the moral world. However, we won't give up the hope that mankind will eventually reach a point of maturity and education at which it can on the one side produce and on the other receive the true philosophy. Simplex sigillum veri, the naked truth, must be so simple and intelligible that it can be imparted to all in its true form, without any admixture of myth and fable, without disguising it in the form of religion. Demophiles. You've no notion how stupid most people are. Philadelphus. I am only expressing a hope which I can't give up. If it were fulfilled, truth in its simple and intelligible form would of course drive religion from the place it is so long occupied as its representative, and by that very means kept open for it. The time would have come when religion would have carried out her object and completed her course. The race she had brought to years of discretion she could dismiss, and herself depart in peace. That would be the euthanasia of religion. But as long as she lives, she has two faces, one of truth, one of fraud. According as you look at one or the other, you will bear her favor or ill will. Religion must be regarded as a necessary evil, its necessity resting on the pitiful imbecility of the great majority of mankind, incapable of grasping the truth, and therefore requiring in its pressing need something to take its place. Demophiles. Really, one would think that you philosophers had truth in a cupboard, and that all you had to do was go and get it. Philalethes. Well, if we haven't got it, it is chiefly owing to the pressure put on philosophy by religion at all times and in all places. People have tried to make the expression and communication of truth even the contemplation and discovery of it impossible, by putting children in their earliest years into the hands of priests to be manipulated, to have the lines in which their fundamental thoughts are henceforth to run laid down with such firmness as, in essential matters, to be fixed and determined for this whole life. When I take up the writings even of the best intellects of the 16th and 17th centuries, more especially if I have been engaged in Oriental studies, I am sometimes shocked to see how they are paralyzed and hemmed in on all sides by Jewish ideas. How can anyone think out the true philosophy when he is prepared like this? Demophiles. Even if the true philosophy were to be discovered, religion wouldn't disappear from the world, as you seem to think. There can't be one system of metaphysics for everybody. That's rendered impossible by the natural differences of intellectual power between man, and the differences, too, which education makes. It is a necessity for the great majority of mankind to engage in that severe bodily labor which cannot be dispensed with if the ceaseless requirements of the whole race are to be satisfied. Not only does this leave the majority no time for education, for learning, for contemplation, but by virtue of the hard and fast antagonism between muscles and mind, the intelligence is blunted by so much exhausting bodily labor, and becomes heavy, clumsy, awkward, and consequently incapable of grasping any other than quite simple situations. At least 9/10 of the human race falls under this category. But still, the people require a system of metaphysics, that is, an account of the world and our existence, because such an account belongs to the most natural needs of mankind. They require a popular system, and to be popular, it must combine many rare qualities. It must be easily understood, and at the same time possess, on the proper points, a certain amount of obscurity, even of impenetrability. Then a correct and satisfactory system of morality must be bound up with its dogmas. Above all, it must afford inexhaustible consolation in suffering and death. The consequence of all of this is that it can only be true in an allegorical and not in a real sense. Further, it must have the support of an authority which is impressive by its great age, by being universally recognized, by its documents, their tone and utterances, qualities which are so extremely difficult to combine that many a man wouldn't be so ready, if he considered the matter, to help to undermine a religion, but would reflect that what he is attacking is a people's most sacred treasure. If you want to form an opinion on religion, you should always bear in mind the character of the great multitude for which it is destined, and form a picture to yourself of its complete inferiority, moral and intellectual. It is incredible how far this inferiority goes, and how perseveringly a spark of truth will glimmer on even under the crudest covering of monstrous fable or grotesque ceremony, clinging indestructibly like the odor of musk to everything that has once come into contact with it. In illustration of this, consider the profound wisdom of the Upanishads, and then look at the mad idolatry of the India of today, with its pilgrimages, processions, and festivities, or at the insane and ridiculous goings-on of the sannyasi. Still, one can't deny that in all this insanity and nonsense there lies some obscure purpose which accords with or is a reflection of the profound wisdom I mentioned. But for the brute multitude, it had to be dressed up in this form. In such a contrast as this, we have two poles of humanity, the wisdom of the individual and the bestiality of the many, both of which find their point of contact in the moral sphere. That saying from the chorale must occur to everybody. Base people look like men, but I have never seen their exact counterpart. The man of education may, all the same, interpret religion to himself cum grano salis. The man of learning, the contemplative spirit, may secretly exchange it for a philosophy. But here again, one philosophy wouldn't suit everybody. By the laws of affinity, every system would draw to itself that public to whose education and capacities it was most suited. So there is always an inferior metaphysical system of the schools for the educated multitude, and a higher one for the elite. Kant's lofty doctrine, for instance, had to be degraded to the level of the schools and ruined by such men as Fries, Krug, and Salat. In short, here, if anywhere, Goethe's maxim is true. One does not suit all. Pure faith in revelation and pure metaphysics are for the two extremes, and for the intermediate steps mutual modifications of both in innumerable combinations and gradations. And this is rendered necessary by the immeasurable differences which nature and education have placed between man and man. Philalethes. The view you take reminds me seriously of the mysteries of the ancients, which you mentioned just now. Their fundamental purpose seems to have been to remedy the evil arising from the differences of intellectual capacity and education. The plan was, out of the great multitude utterly impervious to unveiled truth, to select certain persons who might have it revealed to them up to a given point. Out of these again to choose others to whom more would be revealed, as being able to grasp more, and so on up to the apopts. These grades correspond to the little, greater, and greatest mysteries. The arrangement was founded on a correct estimate of the intellectual inequality of mankind. Demophiles. To some extent, the education in our lower, middle, and high schools corresponds to the varying grades of initiation into the mysteries. Philalethes. In a very approximate way, and then only in so far as subjects of higher knowledge are written about exclusively in Latin. But since that has ceased to be the case, all the mysteries are profaned. Demophiles. However that may be, I wanted to remind you that you should look at religion more from the practical than from the theoretical side. Personified metaphysics may be the enemy of religion, but all the same, personified morality will be its friend. Perhaps the metaphysical element in all religions is false, but the moral element in all is true. This might perhaps be presumed from the fact that they all disagree in their metaphysics, but are in accord as regards morality. Philalethes. Which is an illustration of the rule of logic that false premises may give a true conclusion. Demophiles. Let me hold you to your conclusion. Let me remind you that religion has two sides. If it can't stand when looked at from its theoretical, that is, its intellectual side, on the other hand, from the moral side, it proves itself the only means of guiding, controlling, and mollifying those races of animals endowed with reason, whose kinship with the ape does not exclude a kinship with the tiger. But at the same time religion is, as a rule, a sufficient satisfaction for their dull metaphysical necessities. You don't seem to me to possess a proper idea of the difference, wide as the heavens asunder, the deep gulf between your man of learning and enlightenment, accustomed to the process of thinking, and the heavy, clumsy, dull, and sluggish consciousness of humanity's beasts of burden, whose thoughts have once and for all taken the direction of anxiety about their livelihood, and cannot be put in motion in any other, whose muscular strength is so exclusively brought into play that the nervous power, which makes intelligence, sinks to a very low ebb. People like that must have something tangible which they can lay hold of on the slippery and thorny pathway of their life, some sort of beautiful fable, by means of which things can be imparted to them which their crude intelligence can entertain only in picture and parable. Profound explanations and fine distinctions are thrown away upon them. If you conceive religion in this light, and recollect that its aims are above all practical, and only in a subordinate degree theoretical, it will appear to you as something worthy of the highest respect. Philalethe's, a respect which will finally rest upon the principle that the end sanctifies the means. I don't feel in favor of a compromise on a basis like that. Religion may be an excellent means of training the perverse, obtuse, and ill-disposed members of the biped race. In the eyes of the friend of truth, every fraud, even though it be a pious one, is to be condemned. A system of deception, a pack of lies, would be a strange means of inculcating virtue. The flag to which I have taken the oath is truth. I shall remain faithful to it everywhere, and whether I succeed or not, I shall fight for light and truth. If I see religion on the wrong side? Demophiles. But you won't. Religion isn't a deception. It is true, and the most important of all truths, because its doctrines are, as I have said, of such a lofty kind that the multitude can't grasp them without an intermediary. Because I say its light would blind the ordinary eye, it comes forward wrapped in the veil of allegory, and teaches not indeed what is exactly true in itself, but what is true in the respect of the lofty meaning contained in it. And understood this way, religion is the truth. Philalethes. It would be all right if religion were only at liberty to be true in a merely allegorical sense, but its contention is that it is downright true in the proper sense of the word. Herein lies the deception, and it is here that the friend of truth must take up a hostile position. Demophiles. The deception is a sine qua non. If religion were to admit that it was only the allegorical meaning in its doctrine which was true, it would rob itself of all efficacy. Such rigorous treatment as this would destroy its invaluable influence on the hearts and morals of mankind. Instead of insisting on that with pedantic obstinacy, look at its great achievements in the practical sphere, its furtherance of good and kindly feelings, its guidance in conduct, the support and consolation it gives to suffering humanity in life and death. How much you ought to guard against letting theoretical cavils discredit in the eyes of the multitude and finally wrest from it something which is an inexhaustible source of consolation and tranquility, something which, in its hard lot, it needs so much, even more than we do. On that score alone, religion should be free from attack. Philalethes. With that kind of argument, you could have driven Luther from the field when he attacked the sale of indulgences. How many a one got consolation from the letters of indulgence, a consolation which nothing else could give, a complete tranquility, so that he joyfully departed with the fullest confidence in the packet of them which he held in his hand at the hour of death, convinced that they were so many cards of admission to all the 9 heavens. What is the use of grounds of consolation and tranquility which are constantly overshadowed by the Damocles sword of illusion? The truth, my dear sir, is the only safe thing. The truth alone maintains steadfast and trusty. It is the only solid consolation. It is the indestructible diamond. Demophiles. Yes, if you had truth in your pocket, ready to favor us with it on demand. All you've got are metaphysical systems, in which nothing is certain but the headaches they cost. Before you take anything away, you must have something better put in its place. Philalethes. That's what you keep on saying. To free a man from error is to give, not to take away. Knowledge that a thing is false is a truth. Error always does harm. Sooner or later it will bring mischief to the man who harbors it. Then give up deceiving people. Confess ignorance of what you don't know, and leave everyone to form his own articles of faith for himself. Perhaps they won't turn out so bad, especially as they'll rub one another's corners down and mutually rectify mistakes. The existence of many views will at any rate lay a foundation of tolerance. Those who possess knowledge and capacity may betake themselves to the study of philosophy, and even in their own persons carry the history of philosophy a step further. Demophiles. That'll be a pretty business. A whole nation of raw metaphysicians wrangling and eventually coming to blows with one another. Philalethes. Well, a few blows here and there are the sauce of life, or at any rate, a very inconsiderable evil compared with such things as priestly dominion, plundering of the laity, persecution of heretics, courts of inquisition, crusades, religious wars, massacres of St. Bartholomew. These have been the result of popular metaphysics imposed from without. So I stick to the old saying that you can't get grapes from thistles, nor expect good to come from a pack of lies. Demophiles. How often must I repeat that religion is anything but a pack of lies? It is truth itself, only in a mythical, allegorical vesture. But when you spoke of your plan of everyone being his own founder of religion, I wanted to say that a particularism like this is totally opposed to human nature, and would consequently destroy all social order. Man is a metaphysical animal. That is to say, he has paramount metaphysical necessities. Accordingly, he conceives life above all in its metaphysical signification, and wishes to bring everything into line with that. Consequently, however strange it may sound in view of the uncertainty of all dogmas, agreement in the fundamentals of metaphysics is the chief thing, because a genuine and lasting bond of union is only possible among those who are of one opinion on these points. As a result of this, the main point of likeness and of contrast between nations is rather religion than government, or even language. And so the fabric of society, the state, will stand firm only when founded on a system of metaphysics which is acknowledged by all. This, of course, can only be a popular system, that is, a religion. It becomes part and parcel of the constitution of the state, of all the public acts of individuals. This was the case in ancient India, among the Persians, Egyptians, Jews, Greeks, and Romans. It is still the case in the Brahmin, Buddhist, and Mohammedan nations. In China there are 3 faiths, it is true, of which the most prevalent, Buddhism, is precisely the one which is not protected by the state. Still, there is a saying in China, universally acknowledged and of daily application, that the 3 faiths are only one. That is to say, they agree in essentials. The emperor confesses all 3 together at the same time. And Europe is the union of Christian states. Christianity is the basis of every one of the members and the common bond of all. Hence Turkey, though geographically in Europe, is not properly to be reckoned as belonging to it. In the same way, the European princes hold their place by the grace of God, and the Pope is the vice-regent of God. Accordingly, as his throne was the highest, he used to wish all thrones to be regarded as held in fee from him. In the same way, too, archbishops and bishops, as such, possessed temporal power, and in England they still have seats and votes in the upper house. Protestant princes, as such, are heads of their churches. In England, a few years ago, this was a girl 18 years old. By the revolt from the Pope, the Reformation shattered the European fabric, and in a special degree dissolved the true unity of Germany by destroying its common religious faith. This union, which had practically come to an end, had accordingly to be restored later on by artificial and purely political means. You see, then, how closely connected a common faith is with the social order and the constitution of every state. Faith is everywhere the support of the laws and the constitution, the foundation, therefore, of all social fabric, which could hardly hold together at all if religion did not lend weight to the authority of government and the dignity of the ruler. Philalethes. Oh, yes. Princes use God as a kind of bogey to frighten grown-up children to bed with if nothing else avails. That's why they attach so much importance to the deity. Very well. Let me, in passing, recommend our rulers to give their serious attention regularly, twice every year, by the 15th chapter of the first book of Samuel, that they may be constantly reminded of what it means to prop the throne on the altar. Besides, since the stake, that ultima ratio theologorum, has gone out of fashion, this method of government has lost its efficacy. For, as you know, religions are like glowworms. They shine only when it is dark. A certain amount of general ignorance is the condition of all religions, the element in which alone they can exist. And as soon as astronomy, natural science, geology, history, the knowledge of countries and peoples have spread their light broadcast, and philosophy finally is permitted to say a word, every faith founded on miracles and revelation must disappear, and philosophy takes its place. In Europe, the day of knowledge and science dawned towards the end of the 15th century, with the appearance of the Renaissance Platonists. Its sun rose higher in the 16th and 17th century, so rich in results, and scattered the mists of the Middle Age. Church and faith were compelled to disappear in the same proportion, and so, in the 18th century, English and French philosophers were able to take up an attitude of direct hostility, until, finally, under Frederick the Great, Kant appeared, and took away from religious belief the support it had previously enjoyed from philosophy. He emancipated the handmaid of theology, and in attacking the question with German thoroughness and patience, gave it an earnest instead of a frivolous tone. The consequence of this is that we see Christianity undermined in the 19th century, a serious faith in it almost completely gone. We see it fighting even for bare existence, whilst anxious princes try to set it up a little by artificial means, as a doctor uses a drug on a dying patient. In this connection there is a passage in Condorcet's Des Progrès de l'Esprit Humain, which looks as if written as a warning to our age. The religious zeal shown by philosophers and great men was only a political devotion, and every religion which allows itself to be defended as a belief that may usefully be left to the people can only hope for an agony more or less prolonged. In the whole course of events which I have indicated, you may always observe that faith and knowledge are related as the two scales of balance. When the one goes up, the other goes down. So sensitive is the balance that it indicates momentary influences. When, for instance, at the beginning of this century, those inroads of French robbers under the leadership of Bonaparte and the enormous efforts necessary for driving them out and punishing them had brought about a temporary neglect of science and consequently a certain decline in the general increase of knowledge, the Church immediately began to raise her head again, and faith began to show fresh signs of life, which, to be sure, in keeping with the times, was partly poetical in its nature. On the other hand, in the more than 30 years of peace which followed, leisure and prosperity furthered the building up of science and the spread of knowledge in an extraordinary degree, the consequence of which is what I have indicated, the dissolution and threatened fall of religion. Perhaps the time is approaching which has so often been prophesied, when religion will take her departure from European humanity, like a nurse which the child has outgrown. The child will now be given over to the instructions of a tutor, for there is no doubt that religious doctrines which are founded merely on authority, miracles, and revelations are only suited to the childhood of humanity. Everyone will admit that a race, the past duration of which on the earth all accounts, physical and historical, agree, in placing at not more than some 100 times the life of a man of 60, is as yet only in its first childhood. Demophiles. Instead of taking an undisguised pleasure in prophesying the downfall of Christianity, how I wish you would consider what a measureless debt of gratitude European humanity owes to it. How greatly it has benefited by the religion which, after a long interval, followed it from its old home in the East. Europe received from Christianity ideas which were quite new to it. The knowledge, I mean, of the fundamental truth that life cannot be an end in itself, that the true end of our existence lies beyond it. The Greeks and Romans had placed this end altogether in our present life, so that in this sense they may certainly be called blind heathens. And in keeping with this view of life, all their virtues can be reduced to what is serviceable to the community, to what is useful, in fact. Aristotle says quite naively, those virtues must necessarily be the greatest, which are the most useful to others. So the ancients thought patriotism the highest virtue, although it is really a very doubtful one, since narrowness, prejudice, vanity, and an enlightened self-interest are our main elements in it. Just before the passage I quoted, Aristotle enumerates all the virtues in order to discuss them singly. They are justice, courage, temperance, magnificence, magnanimity, liberality, gentleness, good sense, and wisdom. How different from the Christian virtues! Plato himself, incomparably the most transcendental philosopher of pre-Christian antiquity, knows no higher virtue than justice, and he alone recommends it unconditionally and for its own sake, whereas the rest make a happy life, vita beata, the aim of all virtue, and moral conduct the way to attain it. Christianity freed European humanity from this shallow, crude identification of itself with the hollow, uncertain existence of every day. Coelumque tuere jussit et erectos ad sidera tolere voltus. Christianity, accordingly, does not preach mere justice, but the love of mankind, compassion, good works, forgiveness, love of your enemies, patience, humility, resignation, faith, and hope. It even went a step further and taught that the world is of evil and that we need deliverance. It preached despisal of the world, self-denial, chastity, giving up of one's will, that is, turning away from life and its illusory pleasures. It taught the healing power of pain. An instrument of torture is the symbol of Christianity. I am quite ready to admit that this earnest, this only correct view of life was thousands of years previously spread all over Asia in other forms, as it is still, independently of Christianity. But for European humanity it was a new and great revelation. For it is well known that the population of Europe consists of Asiatic races driven out as wanderers from their own homes, and gradually settling down in Europe. On their wanderings, these races lost the original religion of their homes, and with it the right view of life. So under a new sky they formed religions for themselves, which were rather crude. The worship of Odin, for instance, the Druidic or the Greek religion, the metaphysical content of which was little and shallow. In the meantime, the Greeks developed a special, one might almost say an instinctive sense of beauty, belonging to them alone, of all the nations who have ever existed on the earth, peculiar, fine, and exact, so that their mythology took, in the mouth of their poets and in the hands of their artists, an exceedingly beautiful and pleasing shape. On the other hand, the true and deep significance of life was lost to the Greeks and Romans. They lived on like grown-up children, till Christianity came and recalled them to the serious side of existence. Philalethes. And to see the effects one need only compare antiquity with the Middle Age. the time of Pericles, say, with the 14th century. You could scarcely believe you were dealing with the same kind of beings. There, the finest development of humanity, excellent institutions, wise laws, shrewdly apportioned offices, rationally ordered freedom, all the arts, including poetry and philosophy, at their best. The production of works which, after thousands of years, are unparalleled. The creations, as it were, of a higher order of beings, which we can never imitate. Life embellished by the noblest fellowship, as portrayed in Xenophon's Banquet. Look on the other picture, if you can, a time at which the Church had enslaved the minds and violence the bodies of men, that knights and priests might lay the whole weight of life on the common beast of burden, the third estate. There you have might as right, feudalism and fanaticism in close alliance, and in their train abominable ignorance and darkness of mind, a corresponding intolerance, discord of creeds, religious wars, crusades, inquisitions, and persecutions. As the form of fellowship, chivalry, compounded of savagery and folly, with its pedantic system of false pretenses carried to an extreme, its degrading superstition and apish veneration for women. Gallantry is the residue of this veneration, deservedly requited as it is by feminine arrogance. It affords continual food for laughter to all Asiatics, and the Greeks would have joined in it. In the golden Middle Age, the practice developed into a regular and methodical service of women. It imposed deeds of heroism, cours d'amour, bombastic troubadour songs, etc., although it is to be observed that these last buffooneries, which had an intellectual side, were chiefly at home in France, whereas amongst the material sluggish Germans, the knights distinguished themselves rather by drinking and stealing. They were good at boozing and filling their castles with plunder, though in the courts, to be sure, there was no lack of insipid love songs. What caused this utter transformation? Migration and Christianity. Demophiles. I'm glad you reminded me of it. Migration was the source of the evil. Christianity, the dam on which it broke. It was chiefly by Christianity that the raw, wild hordes which came flooding in were controlled and tamed. The savage man must first of all learn to kneel, to venerate, to obey. After that he can be civilized. This was done in Ireland by St. Patrick, in Germany by Winifred the Saxon, who was a genuine Boniface. It was a migration of peoples, the last advance of Asiatic races towards Europe, followed only by the fruitless attempts of those under Attila, Genghis Khan, and Timur, and, as a comic afterpiece, by the gypsies. It was this movement which swept away the humanity of the ancients. Christianity was precisely the principle which set itself to work against this savagery. Just as later, through the whole of the Middle Age, the Church and its hierarchy were most necessary to set limits to the savage barbarism of those masters of violence, the princes and knights. It was what broke up the ice floes in that mighty deluge. Still, the chief aim of Christianity is not so much to make this life pleasant as to render us worthy of a better. It looks away over this span of time, over this fleeting dream, and seeks to lead us to eternal welfare. Its tendency is ethical in the highest sense of the word, a sense unknown in Europe till its advent, as I have shown you, by putting the morality and the religion of the ancients side by side with those of Christendom. Philalethes. You are quite right as regards theory, but look at the practice. In comparison with the ages of Christianity, the ancient world was unquestionably less cruel than the Middle Age, with its deaths by exquisite torture, its innumerable burnings at the stake. The ancients, further, were very enduring, laid great stress on justice, frequently sacrificed themselves for their country, showed such traces of every kind of magnanimity and such genuine manliness that to this day an acquaintance with their thoughts and actions is called the study of humanity. The fruits of Christianity were religious wars, butcheries, crusades, inquisitions, extermination of the natives in America, and the introduction of African slaves in their place. And among the ancients, there is nothing analogous to this, nothing that can be compared with it. For the slaves of the ancients, the familia, the vernae, were a contented race and faithfully devoted to their master's service, and as different from the miserable Negroes of the sugar plantations, which are a disgrace to humanity, as their two colors are distinct. Those special moral delinquencies for which we reproach the ancients, and which are perhaps less uncommon nowadays than appears on the surface to be the case, are trifles compared with the Christian enormities I have mentioned. Can you then, all considered, maintain that mankind has really been made morally better by Christianity? Demophiles. If the results haven't everywhere been in keeping with the purity and truth of the doctrine, it may be because the doctrine has been too noble, too elevated for mankind, that its aim has been placed too high. It was so much easier to come up to the heathen system, or to the Mohammedan. It is precisely what is noble and dignified that is most liable everywhere to misuse and fraud. Abusus optimi pessimus. Those high doctrines have accordingly now and then served as a pretext for the most abominable proceedings and for acts of unmitigated wickedness. The downfall of the institutions of the Old World, as well of its arts and sciences, is, as I have said, to be attributed to the inroad of foreign barbarians. The inevitable result of this inroad was that ignorance and savagery got the upper hand. Consequently, violence and knavery established their dominion, and knights and priests became a burden to mankind. It is partly, however, to be explained by the fact that the new religion made eternal and not temporal welfare the object of desire, taught that simplicity of heart was to be preferred to knowledge, and looked askance at all worldly pleasure. Now the arts and sciences subserve worldly pleasure, but in so far as they could be made serviceable to religion, they were promoted, and attained a certain degree of perfection. Philalethes. In a very narrow sphere. The sciences were suspicious companions, and as such were placed under restrictions, and on the other hand, darling ignorance, that element so necessary to a system of faith, was carefully nourished. Demophiles. And yet, mankind's possessions in the way of knowledge up to that period, which were preserved in the writings of the ancients, were saved from destruction by the clergy, especially by those in the monasteries. How would it have fared if Christianity hadn't come in just before the migration of the peoples? Philalethes. It would really be a most useful inquiry to try and make with the coldest impartiality an unprejudiced, careful, and accurate comparison of the advantages and disadvantages which may be put down to a religion. For that, of course, a much larger knowledge of historical and psychological data than either of us command would be necessary. Academies might make it a subject for a prize essay. Demophiles. They'll take good care not to do so. Philalethes. I'm surprised to hear you say that. It's a bad lookout for religion. However, there are academies which, in the proposing a subject for competition, make it a secret condition that the prize is to go to the man who best interprets their own view. If we could only begin by getting a statistician to tell us how many crimes are prevented every year by religious, and how many by other motives, there would be very few of the former. If a man feels tempted to commit a crime, you may rely on it that the first consideration which enters his head is the penalty appointed for it, and the chances that it will fall upon him. Then comes, as a second consideration, the the risk to his reputation. If I am not mistaken, he will ruminate by the hour on these two impediments before he ever takes a thought of religious considerations. If he gets safely over these two bulwarks against crime, I think religion alone will very rarely hold him back from it. Demophiles. I think that it will very often do so, especially when its influence works through the medium of custom. An atrocious act is at once felt to be repulsive. What is this but the effect of early impressions? Think, for instance, how often a man, especially if of noble birth, will make tremendous sacrifices to perform what he has promised, motived entirely by the fact that his father has often earnestly impressed upon him in his childhood that a man of honor or a gentleman or a cavalier always keeps his word inviolate. Philalethes. That's no use unless there is a certain inborn honorableness. You mustn't ascribe to religion what results from innate goodness of character, by which compassion for the man who would suffer by his crime keeps a man from committing it. This is the genuine moral motive, and as such it is independent of all religions. Demophiles. But this is a motive which rarely affects the multitude unless it assumes a religious aspect. The religious aspect at any rate strengthens its power for good. Yet without any such foundation, religious motives alone are powerful to prevent crime. We need not be surprised at this in the case of the multitude, when we see that even people of education pass now and then under the influence, not indeed of religious motives, which are founded on something which is at least allegorically true, but of the most absurd superstition, and allow themselves to be guided by it all their life long. For instance, undertaking nothing on a Friday, refusing to sit down 13 at table, obeying chance omens and the like. How much more likely is the multitude to be guided by such things? You can't form any adequate idea of the narrow limits of the mind in its raw state. It is a place of absolute darkness, especially when, as often happens, a bad, unjust, and malicious heart is at the bottom of it. People in this condition, and they form a great bulk of humanity, must be led and controlled as well as may be, even if it be by really superstitious motives, until such time as they become susceptible to truer and better ones. As an instance of the direct working of religion, may be cited the fact common enough, in Italy especially, of a thief restoring stolen goods through the influence of his confessor, who says he won't absolve him if he doesn't. Think again of the case of an oath, where religion shows a most decided influence, whether it be that a man places himself expressly in the position of a purely moral being, and as such looks upon himself as solemnly appealed to, as seems to be in the case in France, where the formula is simply je le jure, and also among the Quakers, whose solemn yea or nay is regarded as a substitute for the oath, or whether it be the man who really believes that he is pronouncing something which may affect his eternal happiness, a belief which is presumably only the investiture of the former feeling. At any rate, religious considerations are a means of awakening and calling out a man's moral nature. How often it happens that a man agrees to take a false oath, and then, when it comes to the point, suddenly refuses, and truth and right win the day. Philalethes. Oftener still, false oaths are really taken, and truth and right trampled underfoot, though all witnesses of the oath know it well. Still, you are right to quote an oath as an undeniable example of the practical efficacy of religion. But, in spite of all you've said, I doubt whether the efficacy of religion goes much beyond this. Just think, if a public proclamation were suddenly made announcing the repeal of all the criminal laws, I fancy neither you nor I would have the courage to go home from here under the protection of religious motives. If, in the same way, all religions were declared untrue, we could, under the protection of the laws alone, go on living as before, without any special addition to our apprehensions or our measures of precaution. I will go beyond this and say that religions have very frequently exercised a decidedly demoralizing influence. One may say generally that duties toward God and duties towards humanity are in inverse ratio. It is easy to let adulation of the deity make amends for lack of proper behavior towards man. And so we see that in all times and in all countries the great majority of mankind find it much easier to beg their way to heaven by prayers than to deserve to go there by their actions. In every religion, it soon comes to be the case that faith, ceremonies, rites, and the like are proclaimed to be more agreeable to the divine will than moral actions. The former, especially if they are bound up with the emoluments of the clergy, gradually come to be looked upon as a substitute for the latter. Sacrifices in temples, the saying of masses, the founding of chapels, the planting of crosses by the roadside, soon come to be the most meritorious works, so that even great crimes are expiated by them, as also by penance, subjection to priestly authority, confessions, pilgrimages, donations to the temples and the clergy, the building of monasteries, and the like. The consequence of all of this is that the priests finally appear as middlemen in the corruption of the gods. And if matters don't go quite so far as that, where is the religion whose adherents don't consider prayers, praise, and manifold acts of devotion a substitute, at least in part, for moral conduct? Look at England, where by an audacious piece of priestcraft, the Christian Sunday, introduced by Constantine the Great as a subject for the Jewish Sabbath, is in a mendacious way identified with it, and takes its name, and this in order that the commands of Jehovah for the Sabbath, that is, the day on which the Almighty had to rest from his 6 days' labor, so that it is essentially the last day of the week, might be applied to the Christian Sunday, the Deis Solis, the first day of the week, which the sun opens in glory, the day of devotion and joy. The consequence of this fraud is Sabbath breaking, or the desecration of the Sabbath. That is, the slightest occupation, whether of business or pleasure, all games, music, sewing, worldly books are on Sundays looked upon as great sins. Surely the ordinary man must believe that if, as his spiritual guides impress upon him, he is only constant in a strict observance of the holy Sabbath, and is a regular attendant at divine service, that is, if he only invariably idles away his time on Sundays, and doesn't fail to sit 2 hours in church to hear the same litany for the 1,000th time, and mutter it in tune with the others, he may reckon on indulgence in regard to those little peccadilloes which he occasionally allows himself. Those devils in human form, the slave owners and slave traders in the free states of North America, they should be called the slave states, are, as a rule, orthodox, pious Anglicans who would consider it a grave sin to work on Sundays, and having confidence in this and their regular attendance at church, they hope for eternal happiness. The demoralizing tendency of religion is less problematical than its moral influence. How great and how certain that moral influence must be to make amends for the enormities which religions, especially the Christian and Mohammedan religions, have produced and spread over the earth. Think of the fanaticism, the endless persecutions, the religious wars, the sanguinary frenzy of which the ancients had no conception. Think of the Crusades, a butchery lasting 200 years and inexcusable. Its war cry, "It is the will of God." Its object, to gain possession of the grave of one who preached love and sufferance. Think of the cruel expulsion and extermination of the Moors and Jews from Spain. Think of the orgies of blood, the inquisitions, the heretical tribunals, the bloody and terrible conquests of the Mohammedans in 3 continents, or those of Christianity in America, whose inhabitants were, for the most part, and in Cuba entirely, exterminated. According to Los Cases, Christianity murdered 12 millions in 40 years. Of course, all in majorem Dei gloriam, and for the propagation of the gospel, and because what wasn't Christian wasn't even looked upon as human. I have, it is true, touched upon these matters before, but when in our day we hear of the latest news from the Kingdom of God, a missionary paper of which the 40th annual number appeared in 1856, we shall not be weary of bringing old news to mind. And above all, don't let us forget India, the cradle of the human race, or at least that part of it to which we belong, where first Mohammedans and then Christians were most cruelly infuriated amongst the adherents of the original faith of mankind. The destruction or disfigurement of the ancient temples and idols, a lamentable, mischievous, and barbarous act, still bears witness to the monotheistic fury of the Mohammedans, carried on from Mahmud, the Ghaznavid of cursed memory, down to Aurangzeb, the fratricide, whom the Portuguese Christians have zealously imitated by destruction of temples and the auto-da-fe of the Inquisition at Goa. Don't let us forget the chosen people of God, who, after they had by Jehovah's express command stolen from their old and trusty friends in Egypt the gold and silver vessels which had been lent to them, made a murderous and plundering inroad into the promised land, with the murderer Moses at their head, tear it from the rightful owners, again by the same Jehovah's express and repeated commands, showing no mercy, exterminating the inhabitants, women, children, and all, in Joshua chapters 9 and 10. And all this simply because they weren't circumcised and didn't know Jehovah, which was reason enough to justify every enormity against them. Just as for the same reason, in earlier times, the infamous knavery of the patriarch Jacob and his chosen people against Hamor, king of Shalem, and his people, is reported to his glory because the people were unbelievers. Genesis 33:18. Truly, it is the worst side of religions that the believers of one religion have allowed themselves every sin against those of another, and with the utmost ruffianism and cruelty persecuted them. The Mohammedans against the Christians and Hindus, the Christians against the Hindus, Mohammedans, American natives, Negroes, Jews, heretics, and others. Perhaps I go too far in saying all religions. For the sake of truth, I must add that the fanatical enormities perpetrated in the name of religion are only to be put down to the adherents of monotheistic creeds, that is, the Jewish faith and its 2 branches, Christianity and Islamism. We hear of nothing of the kind in the case of Hindus and Buddhists, although it is a matter of common knowledge that about the 5th century of our era, Buddhism was driven out by the Brahmins from its ancient home in the southernmost part of the Indian peninsula, and afterwards spread over the whole of the rest of Asia. As far as I know, we have no definite account of any crimes of violence, or wars, or cruelties perpetrated in the course of it. That may, of course, be attributable to the obscurity which veils the history of these countries. But the exceedingly mild character of their religion, together with their unceasing inculcation of forbearance towards all living things, and the fact that Brahmanism, by its caste system, properly admits no proselytes, allows one to hope that their adherents may be acquitted of shedding blood on a large scale, and of cruelty of any form. Spence Hardy, in his excellent book on Eastern monachism, praises the extraordinary tolerance of the Buddhists and adds his assurance that the annals of Buddhism will furnish fewer instances of religious persecution than those of any other religion. As a matter of fact, it is only to monotheism that intolerance is essential, and only God is by his nature a jealous God, which can allow no other God to exist. Polytheistic gods, on the other hand, are naturally tolerant. They live and let live. Their own colleagues are the chief objects of their sufferance, as being gods of the same religion. This toleration is afterwards extended to foreign gods, who are, accordingly, hospitably received, and later on admitted, in some cases, to an equality of rights, the chief example of which is shown by the fact that the Romans willingly admitted and venerated Phrygian, Egyptian, and other gods. Hence it is that monotheistic religions alone furnish the spectacle of religious wars, religious persecutions, heretical tribunals, that breaking of idols and destruction of images of the gods, that razing of Indian temples and Egyptian colossi, which had looked on the sun 3,000 years, just because a jealous God had said, "Thou shalt make no graven image." But to return to the chief point, you are certainly right in insisting on the strong metaphysical needs of mankind. But religion appears to me to be not so much a satisfaction as an abuse of those needs. At any rate, we have seen that in regard to the furtherance of morality, its utility is, for the most part, problematical. Its disadvantages, and especially the atrocities which have followed in its train, are patent to the light of day. Of course, it is quite a different matter if we consider the utility of religion as a prop of thrones. For where those are held by the grace of God, throne and altar are intimately associated, and every wise prince who loves his throne and his family will appear at the head of his people as an exemplar of true religion. Even Machiavelli, in the 18th chapter of his book, most earnestly recommended religion to princes. Beyond this, one may say that revealed religions stand to philosophy exactly in the relation of sovereigns by the grace of God to the sovereignty of the people, so that the two former terms of the parallel are in natural alliance. Demophiles. Oh, don't take that tone. You're going hand in hand with ochlocracy and anarchy, the arch-enemy of all legislative order, all civilization, and all humanity. Philalethes. You are right. It was only a sophism of mine, what the fencing master calls a feint. I retract it. But see how disputing sometimes makes an honest man unjust and malicious. Let us stop. Demophiles. I can't help regretting that, after all the trouble I've taken, I haven't altered your disposition in regard to religion. On the other hand, I can assure you that everything you have said hasn't shaken my conviction of its high value and necessity. Philalethes. I fully believe you. As we may read in Hudibras, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. My consolation is that, alike in controversies and in taking mineral waters, the after effects are the true ones. Demophiles. Well, I hope it will be beneficial in your case. Philalethes. It might be so, if I could digest a certain Spanish proverb. Demophiles. Which is? Philalethes. Behind the cross stands the devil. Demophiles. Come, don't let us part with sarcasms. Let us rather admit that religion, like Janus, or better still, like the Brahmin god of death Yama, has two faces, and like him, one friendly, the other sullen. Each of us has kept his eye fixed on one alone. Philalethes. You are right, old fellow. The Christian System. When the Church says that in the dogmas of religion, reason is totally incompetent and blind, and its use to be reprehended, it is in reality attesting to the fact that these dogmas are allegorical in their nature, and are not to be judged by the standard which reason, taking all things sensu proprio, can alone apply. Now, the absurdities of a dogma are just the mark and sign of what is allegorical and mythical in it. In the case under consideration, however, the absurdities spring from the fact that two such heterogeneous doctrines as those of the Old and New Testaments had to be combined. The great allegory was of gradual growth. Suggested by the external and adventitious circumstances, it was developed by the interpretation put upon them, an interpretation in quiet touch with certain deep-lying truths only half realized. The allegory was finally completed by Augustine, who penetrated deepest into its meaning, and so was able to conceive it as a systematic whole and supply its defects. Hence, the Augustinian doctrine, confirmed by Luther, is the complete form of Christianity. And the Protestants of today, who take revelation sensu proprio and confine it to a single individual, are in error in looking upon the first beginnings of Christianity as its most perfect expression. But the bad thing about all religions is that instead of being able to confess their allegorical nature, they have to conceal it. Accordingly, they parade their doctrine in all seriousness as true sensu proprio, and as absurdities form an essential part of these doctrines, you have the great mischief of a continual fraud. And what is worse, the day arrives when they are no longer true sensu proprio, and then there is an end of them. So that, in that respect, it would be better to admit their allegorical nature at once. But the difficulty is to teach the multitude that something can be both true and untrue at the same time. And as all religions are in a greater or lesser degree of this nature, we must recognize the fact that mankind cannot get on without a certain amount of absurdity. That absurdity is an element in its existence, and illusion indispensable, as indeed other aspects of life testify. I have said that the combination of the Old Testament with the New gives rise to absurdities. Among the examples which illustrate what I mean, I may cite the Christian doctrine of predestination and grace, as formulated by Augustine and adopted from him by Luther, according to which one man is endowed with grace, and another is not. Grace, then, comes to be a privilege received at birth, and brought ready into the world, a privilege, too, in a matter second to none in importance. What is obnoxious and absurd in this doctrine may be traced to the idea contained in the Old Testament, that man is the creation of an external will, which called him into existence out of nothing. It is quite true that genuine moral excellence is really innate, but the meaning of the Christian doctrine is expressed in another and more rational way by the theory of metempsychosis, common to Brahmins and Buddhists. According to this theory, the qualities which distinguish one man from another are received at birth, are brought, that is to say, from another world and a former life. These qualities are not an external gift of grace, but are the fruits of the acts committed in that other world. But Augustine's dogma of predestination is connected with another dogma, namely, that the mass of humanity is corrupt and doomed to eternal damnation, that very few will be found righteous and attain salvation, and that only in consequence of the gift of grace, and because they are predestined to be saved, whilst the remainder will be overwhelmed by the perdition they have deserved, viz., eternal torment in hell. Taken in its ordinary meaning, the dogma is revolting. For it comes to this: it condemns a man who may be perhaps scarcely 20 years of age to expiate his errors or even his unbelief in everlasting torment. Nay more, it makes this almost universal damnation the natural effect of original sin, and therefore the necessary consequence of the fall. This is a result which must have been foreseen by him who made mankind, and who, in the first place, made them not better than they are, and secondly, set a trap for them into which he must have known they would fall, for he made the whole world, and nothing is hidden from him. According to this doctrine, then, God created out of nothing a weak race prone to sin in order to give them over to endless torment. And as a last characteristic, we are told that this God, who prescribes forbearance and forgiveness of every fault, exercises none himself, but does the exact opposite. For a punishment which comes at the end of all things, when the world is over and done with, cannot have for its object either to improve or deter, and is therefore pure vengeance. So that, on this view, the whole race is actually destined to eternal torture and damnation, and created expressly for this end, the only exception being those few persons who are rescued by election of grace. From what motive, one does not know. Putting these aside, it looks as if the blessed Lord had created the world for the benefit of the devil. It would have been so much better not to have made it at all. So much, then, for a dogma taken sensu proprio. But look at it sensu allegorico, and the whole matter becomes capable of a satisfactory interpretation. What is absurd and revolting in this dogma is, in the main, as I said, the simple outcome of Jewish theism, with its creation out of nothing, and really foolish and paradoxical denial of the doctrine of metempsychosis which is involved in that idea, a doctrine which is natural, to a certain extent self-evident, and, with the exception of the Jews, accepted by nearly the whole human race at all times. To remove the enormous evil arising from Augustine's dogma, and to modify its revolting nature, Pope Gregory I in the 6th century very prudently matured the doctrine of purgatory, the essence of which already existed in origin. The doctrine was regularly incorporated into the faith of the Church, so that the original view was much modified, and a certain substitute provided for the doctrine of metempsychosis. For both the one and the other admit a process of purification. To the same end, the doctrine of the restoration of all things, in the Greek apokatastasis, was established, according to which, in the last act of the human comedy, the sinners one and all will be reinstated in integrum. It is only Protestants, with their obstinate belief in the Bible, who cannot be induced to give up eternal punishment in hell. If one were spiteful, one might say, much good may it do them. But it is consoling to think that they really do not believe the doctrine. They leave it alone, thinking in their hearts, it can't be so bad as all that. The rigid and systematic character of his mind led Augustine, in his austere dogmatism and his resolute definition of doctrines only just indicated in the Bible and, as a matter of fact, resting on very vague grounds, to give hard outlines to these doctrines and to put a harsh construction on Christianity. The result of which is that his views offend us, and just as in his day Pelagianism arose to combat them, so now in our day rationalism does the same. Take, for example, the case as he states it generally in the De Civitate Dei, Book 12, Chapter 21. It comes to this: God creates a being out of nothing, forbids him some things, and enjoins others upon him. And because these commands are not obeyed, he tortures them to all eternity with every conceivable anguish, and for this purpose binds soul and body inseparably together, so that instead of the torment destroying this being by splitting him up into his elements, and so setting him free, he may live to eternal pain. This poor creature, formed out of nothing, at least he has a claim on his original nothing. He should be assured, as a matter of right, of this last retreat. which in any case cannot be a very evil one. It is what he has inherited. I, at any rate, cannot help sympathizing with him. If you add to this Augustine's remaining doctrines, that all this does not depend on man's own sins and omissions, but was already predestined to happen, one is really at a loss what to think. Our highly educated rationalists say, to be sure, it's all false, it's a mere bugbear, we're in a state of constant progress, step by step raising ourselves to ever greater perfection. Ah, what a pity we didn't begin sooner. We should already have been there. In the Christian system, the devil is a personage of the greatest importance. God is described as absolutely good, wise, and powerful. And unless he were counterbalanced by the devil, it would be impossible to see where the innumerable and measureless evils which predominate in the world come from, if there were no devil to account for them. And since the rationalists have done away with the devil, the damage inflicted on the other side has gone on growing, and is becoming more and more palpable, as might have been foreseen, and was foreseen, by the orthodox. The fact is, you cannot take away one pillar from a building without endangering the rest of it. And this confirms the view which has been established on other grounds, that Jehovah is a transformation of Ormuzd, and Satan of the Ahriman who must be taken in connection with him. Ormuzd himself is a transformation of Indra. Christianity has this particular disadvantage that, unlike other religions, it is not a pure system of doctrine. Its chief and essential feature is that it is a history, a series of events, a collection of facts, a statement of the actions and sufferings of individuals. It is this history which constitutes dogma, and belief in it is salvation. Other religions, Buddhism, for instance, have, it is true, historical appendages, the life, namely, of their founders. This, however, is not part and parcel of the dogma, but is taken along with it. For example, the Lalita Vistara may be compared with the Gospel so far as it contains the life of Sakyamuni, the Buddha of the present period of the world's history. But this is something which is quite separate and different from the dogma, from the system itself, and for this reason. The lives of the former Buddhas were quite other, and those of the future will be quite other, than the life of the Buddha of today. The dogma is by no means one with the career of its founder. It does not rest on individual persons or events. It is something universal and equally valid at all times. The Lalita Vistara is not, then, a gospel in the Christian sense of the word. It is not the joyful message of an act of redemption. It is the career of him who has shown how each one may redeem himself. The historical constitution of Christianity makes the Chinese laugh at missionaries as storytellers. I may mention here another fundamental error of Christianity, an error which cannot be explained away, and the mischievous consequences of which are obvious every day. I mean the unnatural distinction Christianity makes between man and the animal world to which he really belongs. It sets up man as all-important and looks upon animals as merely things. Brahmanism and Buddhism, on the other hand, true to the facts, recognize in a positive way that man is related generally to the whole of nature, and specially and principally to animal nature. And in their systems, man is always represented by the theory of metempsychosis and otherwise as closely connected with the animal world. The important part played by animals all through Buddhism and Brahmanism, compared with the total disregard of them in Judaism and Christianity, puts an end to any question as to which system is nearer perfection, however much we in Europe may have become accustomed to the absurdity of the claim. Christianity contains, in fact, a great and essential imperfection in limiting its precepts to man, and in refusing rights to the entire animal world. As religion fails to protect animals against the rough, unfeeling, and often more than bestial multitude, the duty falls to the police. And as the police are unequal to the task, societies for the protection of animals are now formed all over Europe and America. In the whole of uncircumcised Asia, such a procedure would be the most superfluous thing in the world, because animals are there sufficiently protected by religion, which even makes them objects of charity. How such charitable feelings bear fruit may be seen, to take an example, in the great hospital for animals at Surat, whither Christians, Mohammedans, and Jews can send their sick beasts which, if cured, are very rightly not restored to their owners. In the same way, when a Brahmin or a Buddhist has a slice of good luck, a happy issue in any affair, instead of mumbling a Te Deum, he goes to the marketplace and buys birds and opens their cages to the city gate, a thing which may be frequently seen in Astrakhan, where the adherents of every religion meet together, and so on in 100 similar ways. On the other hand, look at the revolting ruffianism with which our Christian public treats its animals, killing them for no object at all and laughing over it, or mutilating or torturing them. Even its horses, who form its most direct means of livelihood, are strained to the utmost in their old age, and the last strength worked out of their poor bones until they succumb at last under the whip. One might say with truth, mankind are the devils of the earth, and the animals the souls they torment. But what can you expect from the masses, when there are men of education, zoologists even, who, instead of admitting what is so familiar to them, the essential identity of man and animal, are bigoted and stupid enough to offer a zealous opposition to their honest and rational colleagues when they class man under the proper head as an animal, or demonstrate the resemblance between him and the chimpanzee or the orangutan. It is a revolting thing that a writer who is so pious and Christian in his sentiments as Jung Stilling should use a simile like this in his Szenen aus dem Geisterreich, Book 2, Supplement 1, page 15. Suddenly, the skeleton shriveled up into an indescribably hideous and dwarf-like form, just as when you bring a large spider into the focus of a burning glass and watch the purulent blood hiss and bubble from the heat. This man of God, then, was guilty of such infamy, or looked on quietly when another was committing it. In either case it comes to the same thing here. So little harm did he think of it that he tells us of it in passing and without a trace of emotion. Such are the effects of the first chapter of Genesis, and, in fact, of the whole of the Jewish conception of nature. The standard recognized by the Hindus and Buddhists is the Mahavakya, the great word. Tatvamasi, this is thyself, which may always be spoken of every animal, to keep us in mind of the identity of his most inmost being with ours. Perfection of morality indeed. Nonsense. The fundamental characteristics of the Jewish religion are realism and optimism, views of the world which are closely allied. They form, in fact, the conditions of theism. For theism looks upon the material world as absolutely real, and regards life as a pleasant gift bestowed upon us. On the other hand, the fundamental characteristics of the Brahmin and Buddhist religions are idealism and pessimism, which look upon the existence of the world as in the nature of a dream, and life as the result of our sins. In the doctrines of the Zendavesta, from which, as is well known, Judaism sprang, the pessimistic element is represented by Ahriman. In Judaism, Ahriman has as Satan only a subordinate position, but like Ahriman, he is the lord of snakes, scorpions, and vermin. But the Jewish system forthwith employs Satan to correct its fundamental error of optimism, and in the fall introduces the element of pessimism, a doctrine demanded by the most obvious facts of the world. There is no truer idea in Judaism than this, although it transfers to the course of existence and must be represented as its foundation and antecedent. The New Testament, on the other hand, must be in some way traceable to an Indian source. Its ethical system, its ascetic view of morality, its pessimism, and its avatar are all thoroughly Indian. It is its morality which places it in a position of such emphatic and essential antagonism to the Old Testament, so that the story of the fall is the only possible point of connection between the two. For when the Indian doctrine was imported into the land of promise, two very different things had to be combined. On the one hand, the consciousness of the corruption and misery of the world, its need of deliverance and salvation through an avatar, together with a morality based on self-denial and repentance. On the other hand, the Jewish doctrine of monotheism, with its corollary that all things are very good, in the Greek pantakalalian, and the task succeeded as far as it could, as far, that is, as it was possible to combine two such heterogeneous and antagonistic creeds. As ivy clings for the support and stay it wants to a rough-hewn post, everywhere conforming to its irregularities and showing their outline, but at the same time covering them with life and grace, and changing the former aspect into one that is pleasing to the eye, so the Christian faith, sprung from the wisdom of India, overspreads the old trunk of rude Judaism, a tree of alien growth. The original form must in part remain, but it suffers a complete change and becomes full of life and truth, so that it appears to be the same tree, but is really another. Judaism had presented the Creator as separated from the world, which he produced out of nothing. Christianity identifies this Creator with the Savior, and through him with humanity. He stands as their representative. They are redeemed in him. Just as they fell in Adam, they have lain ever since in the bonds of iniquity, corruption, suffering, and death. Such is the view taken by Christianity in common with Buddhism. The world can no longer be looked at in the light of Jewish optimism, which found all things very good. Nay, in the Christian scheme, the devil is named as its prince or ruler. In the Greek, ho archon tou kosmotoutou. John 12:33. The world is no longer an end but a means, and the realm of everlasting joy lies beyond it and the grave. Resignation in this world and direction of all our hopes to a better form the spirit of Christianity. The way to this end is opened by the atonement, that is, the redemption from this world and its ways. And in the moral system, instead of the law of vengeance, there is the command to love your enemy. Instead of the promise of innumerable posterity, the assurance of eternal life. Instead of visiting the sins of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations, the Holy Spirit governs and overshadows all. We see then that the doctrines of the Old Testament are rectified and their meaning changed by those of the New, so that in the most important and essential matters, an agreement is brought about between them and the old religions of India. Everything which is true in Christianity may also be found in Brahmanism and Buddhism. But in Hinduism and Buddhism, you will look in vain for any parallel to the Jewish doctrines of a nothing quickened into life, or of a world made in time, which cannot be humble enough in its thanks and praises to Jehovah for an ephemeral existence full of misery, anguish, and need. Whoever seriously thinks that superhuman beings have ever given our race information as to the aim of its existence and that of the world is still in his childhood. There is no other revelation than the thoughts of the wise, even though these thoughts, liable to error as is the lot of everything human, are often clothed in strange allegories and myths under the name of religion. So far, then, it is a matter of indifference whether a man lives or dies in reliance on his own or another's thoughts, for it is never more than human thought, human opinion, which he trusts. Still, instead of trusting what their own minds tell them, men have, as a rule, a weakness for trusting others who pretend to supernatural sources of knowledge. And in view of the enormous intellectual inequality between man and man, it is easy to see that the thoughts of one mind might appear, in some sense, a revelation to another. Chapter 3. Psychological Observations. For every animal, and more especially for man, a certain conformity and proportion between the will and the intellect is necessary for existing or making any progress in the world. The more precise and correct the proportion which nature establishes, the more easy, safe, and agreeable will be the passage through the world. Still, if the right point is only approximately reached, it will be enough to ward off destruction. There are then certain limits within which the said proportion may vary, and yet preserve a correct standard of conformity. The normal standard is as follows. The object of the intellect is to light and lead the will on its path, and therefore the greater the force, impetus, and passion which spurs on the will from within, the more complete and luminous must be the intellect which is attached to it. That the vehement strife of the will, the glow of passion, and the intensity of the emotions may not lead man astray, or urge him on to ill-considered, false, or ruinous action. This will inevitably be the result if the will is very violent and the intellect very weak. On the other hand, a phlegmatic character, a weak and languid will, can get on and hold its own with a small amount of intellect. What is naturally moderate needs only moderate support. The general tendency of a want of proportion between the will and the intellect, in other words, of any variation from the normal proportion I have mentioned, is to produce unhappiness, whether it be that the will is greater than the intellect, or the intellect greater than the will. Especially is this the case when the intellect is developed to an abnormal degree of strength and superiority, so as to be out of all proportion to the will, a condition which is the essence of real genius. The intellect is then not only more than enough for the needs and aims of life, it is absolutely prejudicial to them. The result is that, in youth, excessive energy in grasping the objective world, accompanied by a vivid imagination and a total lack of experience, makes the mind susceptible and an easy prey to extravagant ideas, nay, even to chimeras. And the result is an eccentric and fantastic character. And when, in later years, this state of mind yields and passes away under the teaching of experience, still the genius never feels himself at home in the common world of every day and the ordinary business of life. He will never take his place in it and accommodate himself to it as accurately as a person of moral intellect. He will be much more likely to make curious mistakes. For the ordinary mind feels itself so completely at home in the narrow circle of its ideas and views of the world that no one can get the better of it in that sphere. Its faculties remain true to their original purpose, viz., to promote the service of the will. It devotes itself steadfastly to this end, and abjures extravagant aims. The genius, on the other hand, is at bottom a monstrum per excessum, just as, conversely, the passionate, violent, and unintelligent man, the brainless barbarian, is a monstrum per defectum. The will to live, which forms the inmost core of every living being, exhibits itself most conspicuously in the higher order of animals, that is, the cleverer ones. and so in them the nature of the will may be seen and examined most clearly. For in the lower orders its activity is not so evident. It has a lower degree of objectification. Whereas, in the class which stands above the higher order of animals, that is, in men, reason enters in, and with reason comes discretion, and with discretion the capacity of dissimulation, which throws a veil over the operations of the will. And in mankind, consequently, the will appears without its mask only in the affections and the passions. And this is the reason why passion, when it speaks, always wins credence, no matter what the passion may be, and rightly so. For the same reason the passions are the main theme of poets, and the stalking horse of actors. The conspicuousness of the will in the lower order of animals explains the delight we take in dogs, apes, cats, etc. It is the entirely naive way in which they express themselves that gives us so much pleasure. The sight of any free animal going about its business undisturbed, seeking its food or looking after its young or mixing in the company of its kind, all the time being exactly what it ought to be and can be, what a strange pleasure it gives us. Even if it is only a bird, I can watch it for a long time with delight, or a water rat, or a hedgehog, or better still, a weasel, a deer, or a stag. The main reason why we take so much pleasure in looking at animals is that we like to see our own nature in such a simplified form. There is only one mendacious being in the world, and that is man. Every other is true and sincere and makes no attempt to conceal what it is, expressing its feelings just as they are. Many things are put down to the force of habit, which are rather to be attributed to the constancy and immutability of original innate character, according to which, under like circumstances, we always do the same thing, whether it happens for the first or the 100th time. It is in virtue of the same necessity. Real force of habit, as a matter of fact, rests upon that indolent, passive disposition which seeks to relieve the intellect and the will of a fresh choice, and so makes us do what we did yesterday and have done 100 times before, and of which we know that it will attain its object. But the truth of the matter lies deeper, and a more precise explanation of it can be given than appears at first sight. Bodies which may be moved by mechanical means only are subject to the power of inertia, and applied to bodies which may be acted on by motives, this power becomes the force of habit. The actions which we perform by mere habit come about, in fact, without any individual separate motive brought into play for the particular case. Hence, in performing them, we really do not think about them. A motive was present only on the first few occasions on which the action happened, which has since become a habit. The secondary after-effect of this motive is the present habit, and it is sufficient to enable the action to continue. Just as when a body had been set in motion by a push, it requires no more pushing in order to continue its motion. It will go on to all eternity, if it meets with no friction. It is the same in the case of animals. Training is a habit which is forced upon them. The horse goes on drawing his cart quite contentedly, without having to be urged on. The motion is the continued effect of those strokes of the whip which urged him on at first. By the law of inertia, they have become perpetuated as habit. All this is really more than a mere parable. It is the underlying identity of the will at very different degrees of its objectification, in virtue of which the same law of motion takes such different forms. Vive muchos años is the ordinary greeting in Spain, and all over the earth it is quite customary to wish people a long life. It is presumably not a knowledge of life which directs such a wish. It is rather knowledge of what man is in his inmost nature, the will to live. The wish which everyone has that he may be remembered after his death, a wish which rises to the longing for posthumous glory in the case of those whose aims are high, seems to me to spring from this clinging to life. When the time comes which cuts a man off from every possibility of real existence, he strives after a life which is still attainable, even though it be a shadowy and ideal one. The deep grief we feel at the loss of a friend arises from the feeling that in every individual there is something which no words can express, something which is particularly his own and therefore irreparable. Omne individuum ineffabile. We may come to look upon the death of our enemies and adversaries, even long after it has occurred, with just as much regret as we feel for that of our friends, viz., when we miss them as witnesses of our brilliant success. That the sudden announcement of a very happy event may easily prove fatal rests upon the fact that happiness and misery depend merely on the proportion which our claims bear to what we get. Accordingly, the good things we possess, or are certain of getting, are not felt to be such, because all pleasure is in fact of a negative nature and affects the relief of pain, while pain or evil is what is really positive. It is the object of immediate sensation. With the possession or certain expectation of good things, our demands rises, and increases our capacity for further possession and larger expectations. But if we are depressed by continual misfortune, and our claims reduced to a minimum, the sudden advent of happiness finds no capacity for enjoying it. Neutralized by an absence of pre-existing claims, its effects are apparently positive, and so its whole force is brought into play. Hence it may possibly break our feelings, i.e., be fatal to them. And so, as is well known, one must be careful in announcing great happiness. First, one must get the person to hope for it, then open up the prospect of it, then communicate part of it, and at last make it fully known. Every portion of the good news loses its efficacy, because it is anticipated by a demand, and room is left for an increase in it. In view of all this, it may be said that our stomach for good fortune is bottomless, but the entrance to it is narrow. These remarks are not applicable to great misfortunes in the same way. They are more seldom fatal because hope always sets itself against them. That an analogous part is not played by fear in the case of happiness results from the fact that we are instinctively more inclined to hope than to fear, just as our eyes turn of themselves towards light rather than darkness. Hope is the result of confusing the desire that something should take place with the probability that it will. Perhaps no man is free from this folly of the heart, which deranges the intellect's correct appreciation of probability to such an extent that if the chances are 1,000 to 1 against it, yet the event is thought a likely one. Still, in spite of this, a sudden misfortune is like a death stroke, whilst a hope that is always disappointed and still never dies is like death by prolonged torture. He who has lost all hope has also lost all fear. This is the meaning of the expression desperate. It is natural to a man to believe what he wishes to be true, and to believe it because he wishes it. If this characteristic of our nature, at once beneficial and assuaging, is rooted out by many hard blows of fate, and a man comes conversely to a condition in which he believes a thing must happen because he does not wish it, and what he wishes to happen can never be just because he wishes it, this is in reality the state described as desperation. That we are so often deceived in others is not because our judgment is at fault, but because, in general, as Bacon says, intellectus luminis sici non est, sed recipit infusionem a voluntate et affectibus. That is to say, Trifles unconsciously bias us for or against a person from the very beginning. It may also be explained by our not abiding by the qualities which we really discover. We go on to conclude the presence of others which we think inseparable from them, or the absence of those which we consider incompatible. For instance, when we perceive generosity, we infer justice. From piety, we infer honesty. From lying, deception. From deception, stealing, etc. A procedure which opens the door to many false views, partly because human nature is so strange, partly because our standpoint is so one-sided. It is true, indeed, that character always forms a consistent and connected whole, but the roots of all its qualities lie too deep to allow of our concluding from particular data in a given case whether certain qualities can or cannot exist together. We often happen to say things that may in some way or other be prejudicial to us, but we keep silent about things that might make us look ridiculous. Because in this case, effect follows very quickly on cause. The pain of an unfulfilled wish is small in comparison with that of repentance, for the one stands in the presence of the vast open future, while the other has the irrevocable past closed behind it. Geduld, paciencia, patience, especially the Spanish sufrimiento, is strongly connected with the notion of suffering. It is therefore a passive state, just as the opposite is an active state of the mind, with which, when great, patience is incompatible. It is the innate virtue of a phlegmatic, indolent, and spiritless people, and also of women. But that it is nevertheless so very useful and necessary is a sign that the world is very badly constituted. Money is human happiness in the abstract. He, then, who is no longer capable of enjoying human happiness in the concrete, devotes his heart entirely to money. Obstinacy is the result of the will forcing itself into the place of the intellect. If you want to find out your real opinion of anyone, observe the impression made upon you by the first sight of a letter from him. The course of our individual life and the events in it, as far as their true meaning and connection is concerned, may be compared to a piece of rough mosaic. So long as you stand close in front of it, you cannot get a right view of the objects presented, nor perceive their significance or beauty. Both come in sight only when you stand a little way off, and in the same way you often understand the true connection of important events in your life, not while they're going on, nor soon after they are past, but only a considerable time afterwards. Is this so because we require the magnifying effect of imagination? Or because we can get a general view only from a distance? Or because the school of experience makes our judgment ripe? Perhaps all of these together. But it is certain that we often view in the right light the actions of others, and occasionally even our own, only after the lapse of years. And as it is in one's own life, so is it in history. Happy circumstances in life are like certain groups of trees. Seen from a distance, they look very well, but go up to them and amongst them, and the beauty vanishes. You don't know where it can be. It is only trees, you see. And so it is that we often envy the lot of others. The doctor sees all the weakness of mankind, the lawyer all the wickedness, the theologian all the stupidity. A person of phlegmatic disposition, who is a blockhead, would, with a sanguine nature, be a fool. Now and then, one learns something, but one forgets the whole day long. Moreover, our memory is like a sieve, the holes of which in time get larger and larger. The older we get, the quicker anything entrusted to it slips from the memory, whereas what was fixed fast in it in early days is there still. The memory of an old man gets clearer and clearer the further it goes back, and less clear the nearer it approaches the present time. so that his memory, like his eyes, becomes short-sighted. In the process of learning, you may be apprehensive about bewildering and confusing the memory, but not about overloading it, in the strict sense of the word. The faculty for remembering is not diminished in proportion to what one has learned, just as little as the number of molds in which you cast sand lessens its capacity for being cast in new molds. In this sense, the memory is bottomless, and yet, the greater and more various anyone's knowledge, the longer he takes to find out anything that may suddenly be asked him, because he is like a shopkeeper who has to get the article wanted from a large and multifarious store, or more strictly speaking, because out of many possible trains of thought he has to recall exactly that one which, as a result of previous training, leads to the matter in question. For the memory is not a repository of things you wish to preserve, but a mere dexterity of the intellectual powers. Hence, the mind always contains its sum of knowledge only potentially, never actually. It sometimes happens that my memory will not reproduce some word in a foreign language, or a name, or some artistic expression, although I know it very well. After I have bothered myself in vain about it for a longer or a shorter time, I give up thinking about it altogether. An hour or two afterwards, in rare cases even later still, sometimes only after 4 or 5 weeks, the word I was trying to recall occurs to me while I am thinking of something else, as suddenly as if someone had whispered it to me. After noticing this phenomenon with wonder for very many years, I have come to think that the probable explanation of it is as follows. After the troublesome and unsuccessful search, my will retains its craving to know the word, and so sets a watch for it in the intellect. Later on, in the course and play of thought, some word by chance occurs having the same initial letters or some other resemblance to the word which is sought. Then the sentinel springs forward and supplies what is wanting to make up the word, seizes it, and suddenly brings it up in triumph without my knowing where and how he got it. So it seems as if someone had whispered it to me. It is the same process as that adopted by a teacher towards a child who cannot repeat a word. The teacher just suggests the first letter of the word, or even the second, too. Then the child remembers it. In default of this process, you can end by going methodically through all the letters of the alphabet. In the ordinary man, injustice rouses a passionate desire for vengeance, and it has often been said that vengeance is sweet. How many sacrifices have been made just to enjoy the feeling of vengeance, without any intention of causing any amount of injury equivalent to what one has suffered? The bitter death of the centaur Nessus was sweetened by the certainty that he had used his last moments to work out an extremely clever vengeance. Walter Scott expresses the same human inclination in language as true as it is strong. Vengeance is the sweetest morsel to the mouth that ever was cooked in hell. I shall now attempt a psychological explanation of it. Suffering, which falls to our lot in the course of nature, or by chance or fate, does not, ceteris paribus, seem so painful as suffering which is inflicted on us by the arbitrary will of another. This is because we look upon nature and chance as the fundamental masters of the world. We see that the blow we receive from them might just as well have fallen on another. In the case of suffering which springs from this source, we bewail the common lot of humanity rather than our own misfortune. But that it is the arbitrary will of another which inflicts the suffering is a particularly bitter addition to the pain or injury it causes, viz., the consciousness that someone else is superior to us, whether by force or cunning, while we lie helpless. If amends are possible, amends heal the injury. But that bitter addition, and it was you who did that to me, which is often more painful than the injury itself, is only to be neutralized by vengeance. by inflicting injury on the one who has injured us, whether we do it by force or cunning, is to show our superiority to him, and to annul the proof of his superiority to us. That gives our hearts the satisfaction towards which it yearns. So where there is a great deal of pride and vanity, there also will be a great desire of vengeance. But as the fulfillment of every wish brings with it more or less of a sense of disappointment, so it is with vengeance. The delight we hope to get from it is mostly embittered by compassion. Vengeance taken will often tear the heart and torment the conscience. The motive to it is no longer active, and what remains is the evidence of our malice.